now we're walking around with a balance that's chronically tilted to the side of pain. We've actually changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we need to use not to get high or feel pleasure, but just to level the balance and feel normal.
여러분 안녕하십니까, 돌콩입니다. 오늘은 감히 제 인생을 바꿨다고 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같은 인터뷰 한 편을 가지고 왔습니다. 바로 스탠퍼드 의과대학에서 중독의학을 전공하시는 닥터 애나 렘키와의 인터뷰인데요. 도파민네이션이라는 책 여러분들 많이 아시죠? 작가님으로 많이들 알고 계실 거라고 생각합니다. 사실 중독이라고 하면 알코올 중독이나 약물 중독처럼 물질 중독을 생각하기가 쉽지만 요즘은 행동 중독, 그러니까 SNS 중독, 스마트폰 중독, 쇼핑 중독, 먹는 행위에 대한 중독, 먹방 시청 중독, 비디오 게임 중독, 쇼핑 중독, 도박 중독, 그 행동 중독에 관한 관심도 굉장히 많이 늘어나고 있고 그에 대해서 고민들도 많이 가지고 계실 거라고 생각을 합니다. Everybody has their own demons 라고 하잖아요. 사람에게는 모두 자신만의 내면의 악마가 있다라고 하는데 저도 물론 제 내면의 악마가 있습니다. 첫 번째로 스마트폰. 제가 스마트폰 중독과 굉장히 오랜 시간 싸워왔다는 사실을 사실 채널을 오랫동안 보신 분들이라면 아실지도 모른다라고 생각을 해요. 저는 노 스마트폰 챌린지도 여러 번 했었고 스마트폰 그 잠금 장치 이렇게 상자 안에 넣어가지고 시간 설정하면 안 열리는 그 장치도 가지고 있어요. 그런데 그 어떤 시도들도 장기적인 변화로 이어지지가 않았어요. 그 굉장히 좌절스럽더라고요. 나는 시도를 계속 하는데 왜 이게 안 바뀌지? 라는 사실 때문에. 그리고 한 가지 또 다른 저만의 악마가 있다면 바로 술입니다. 팬데믹 기간 동안 제 음주량이 굉장히 많이 늘어났는데 이제 생활이 다시 팬데믹 전에 그 패턴으로 돌아오면서 음주량을 줄여야 되겠다라는 생각을 했는데 그게 제 마음대로 안 된다는 사실을 깨달았을 때 굉장히 무서웠어요. 저희 집 가계도를 보면 제가 술을 마시고 있으면 안 되는 번지수예요. 왜냐하면은 저는 할아버지도 알코올성 치매로 돌아가셨고 엄마 쪽, 아빠 쪽 어르신들이 전부 다 술을 너무 좋아하셨어요. 그리고 건강상의 문제가 있으셨고 그래서 술이란 건 제가 참 좋아하긴 하지만 평생 훈련을 해가야 되는 부분이라고 생각을 했어요. 그런 말이 있잖아요. It's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. 뭔가에 중독된 게 너의 잘못은 아닐 수 있지만 네가 조금씩 이렇게 해결을 해가야 되는 너의 책임, 네가 할 일이기는 하다라는 말이죠. 근데 그게 제 마음대로 이렇게 길들여지지 않는다라는 사실을 깨달았을 때 굉장히 두려웠고 그래서 닥터 렘키의 책 도파민네이션도 열심히 읽고 렘키 박사님을 컨택을 해서 인터뷰를 하게 됐는데 인터뷰를 하는 동안 되게 신기한 일이 일어났다라는 생각을 해요. 날짜도 기억을 해요. 3월 13일에 아침에 이 인터뷰를 했었는데 오늘이 4월 10일이거든요. 그래서 28일째 제 금주 트래커인데 28일째 금주를 잘 하고 있습니다. 어렵지 않게 잘 하고 있어요. 어떤 일이 일어났던 걸까? 라고 생각을 해봤더니 일단은 무언가에 중독되어 사는 동안 내 뇌에서는 어떤 일이 일어나는가를 명확히 이해하는 게 도움이 됐어요. 그리고 두 번째로 닥터 렘키가 본인의 중독 이야기, 로맨스 소설에 중독되었던 그 이야기를 책에서 나누어주고 계신데 여러 번 내 악마에게서 벗어나려는 시도를 하지만 그게 궁극적인 변화로 이어지지 않는 것에 대한 그 좌절감 을 잘 이해받는 듯한 그 느낌이 들었어요. 그 시도가 힘듦에도 불구하고 왜 우리가 그걸 계속 시도해야 하는지 중독에서 벗어난 삶은 얼마나 자유롭고 아름다운지에 대한 것들을 감정적으로도 잘 박사님께서 공감해 주시고 상기시켜 주셨다는 느낌이 들어서 과학적인 이해와 감정적인 공감이 모두 있었던 그런 인터뷰가 아니었나. 그래서 제게도 그런 변화가 일어나지 않았나라는 생각을 합니다. 오늘의 인터뷰가 제게는 회복이었고 또 변화의 시작이기도 했는데 비슷한 문제로 고민하고 계신 분들이 계시다면 여러분들께도 그러하기를 진심으로 바랍니다.
When we talk about alcoholism or substance abuse, we know that it is bad because there are obvious health consequences, and also we see a lot of bad examples probably around, so we know that it's somewhat bad. But some behavioral addiction, being addicted to Netflix, being addicted to YouTube or social media shopping, eating, mukbang, video gaming, other things, right? Let's say that I'm doing my job well and I'm not harming anyone, but is that still bad? Is that still that we should recover from? And why is that?
Yeah, that's a Great question. So thank you for asking that. When we think about how we're harming our bodies with addictive behaviors, for example, digital addictions, tech, the internet, our devices, we really need to conceptualize the brain as the end organ that is being damaged. It's true that alcohol damages the liver and the pancreas and the brain and other organs, the heart too, and that's not so true of behavioral addictions. But behavioral addictions do cause a kind of brain damage. And specifically, the brain damage that they cause is by flooding our brains with these highly reinforcing behaviors and essentially releasing a lot of dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter, in a specific part of the brain called the reward circuit. What ends up happening is that our brains have to try to compensate for all of that reward by downregulating or decreasing our own dopamine production and transmission, so that ultimately we change our hedonic or joy set point, and we end up in a chronic dopamine deficit state. And that is the damage that we're causing, because that state is very similar to depression. The universal symptoms of withdrawal, or the dopamine deficit state, are anxiety, irritability, depression, insomnia, inattention, as well as craving or intrusive thoughts of wanting to use our drug of choice and manufacturing lots of narratives to that end. I also want to add that as with addictions to drugs and alcohol, there are a lot of interpersonal consequences as a result of addiction to the internet and to our devices. For example, we're much less present in real time for other people. I see a lot of parents, for example, who are not able to be fully present for their children, people who are not able to be present for their spouses or other family members or friends because of the amount of time, energy, and creativity they're putting into consuming, digital media.
Yeah, so I was going to ask this question later on in the interview, but I want to jump into this section in the book called The Pleasure and Pain Balance. So basically, there is a chapter you talk about this balance between pleasure and pain, and they are co-located, which was fascinating to me. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Because I do have a follow-up question about that.
Sure. So by almost any brain measure, what we find is that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and it looks like they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine a beam on a central fulcrum, and that beam represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we do something pleasurable, like watch a Netflix movie, we experience pleasure. That releases dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, and the balance tilts to the side of pleasure. When we burn our hand on a hot stove, that tilts the balance to the side of pain. And there are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain in the level position, that is to say, parallel with the ground, so that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains are going to work very hard to restore a level balance. And the way that our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So let's say I eat a piece of chocolate or drink a glass of wine, that releases dopamine. I then get a tilt to the side of pleasure. But as soon as that happens, my brain adapts by downregulating dopamine transmission and production. I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of my balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins really like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until the balance is tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the blue Monday, or that moment of wanting one more piece of chocolate or to watch one more TikTok video. Now, if I wait long enough, those gremlins hop off and a level balance is restored. But the key piece here is that for every pleasure, we pay a price. And that price is the feeling, however fleeting, of pain in its aftermath, usually manifested as cravings for wanting to do it again. Now, you might ask yourself, why would Mother Nature make a pleasure-pain balance that requires us to feel pain after every pleasure. Well, it's not that Mother Nature is cruel for no reason. It's that this kind of configuration is highly adaptive for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that human beings have existed in for most of humanity, which is to say, what better way to motivate the organism to continually seek the next pleasure than by ensuring that that pleasure is fleeting, very short in duration, and by making the organism experience pain in its aftermath, which then motivates the individual to get out of pain by seeking yet more pleasure. So that's the first rule of the balance. Now, to understand what happens in the brain as we get addicted, it's important to appreciate that this balance was created over many years of evolution for very modest rewards that were very difficult to acquire. The idea being we would have to do a lot of work to find, a drink of water or a berry bush with 5 berries on it. But now we live in this world that we have created of overwhelming overabundance. Almost every behavior has become drugified. So now what we're doing is we're slamming down on the pleasure side really hard and really fast, right? Now we need a whole lot more gremlins hopping on the pain side to restore homeostasis. And with repeated exposure to the same or similar rewarding stimulus, we start to accumulate more and more gremlins on the pain side of the balance in an effort to try to restore homeostasis. But eventually what happens is that there are enough gremlins on that pain side to fill this whole room, and now they're camped out there. They've got their tents, their barbecues, they're not going anywhere. And now we're walking around with a balance that's chronically tilted to the side of pain. We've actually changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we need to use not to get high or feel pleasure, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And when we're not using, we're walking around feeling the universal symptoms of withdrawal, which again are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving.
So when I read that part, it was super interesting, but also I was a little bit scared because I want to have fun in my life, and I also want to have what people call big time in my career, in my life, right? So I want to experience that excitement and adrenaline surge sometimes. But according to your book, that will be definitely followed by some kind of pain and some kind of depressive feelings and emotions. So I was a little bit worried. But we still want to thrive in our career and in life, and we still want to have a lot of fun. Then what can we do? Obviously we don't want to experience pain, but is that just a way to go? Should we just soak it up? And what's there?
Yeah, I think one way to think about this is there's sort of good dopamine and bad dopamine. In fact, it's all the same dopamine. But the way that we get our dopamine, and of course we want to experience, pleasure and joy in our lives. We are reflexively designed to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And dopamine is our key reward and pleasure neurotransmitter. But, it's a matter of how much dopamine, how often, and what we did to get there. When we're talking about intoxicants, whether it's cannabis, cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, pornography, video games, certain types of social media, those are drugs, and they release a lot of dopamine very quickly in our brains. And if we're going to engage in those types of high potency intoxicants, we just have to make sure that we leave enough time in between use to let those gremlins hop off so that we can restore homeostasis. What happens when we get into repeated, especially daily use, is that we accumulate those gremlins on the pain side of the balance and push ourselves into the dopamine deficit state. We also have to pay attention to quantity when we use intoxicants, because if we're using a whole lot of them, we're slamming that balance down hard and fast to the side of pleasure, and potentially over time, maybe doing some damage to that balance. So we want to keep a subtle, easily responsive balance that most of the time hangs out here in homeostasis, but is also responsive to rewards and painful stimuli. And what we're essentially doing in stimulating our brains all the time with all of these reinforcers is we're making it impossible to appreciate those more modest rewards, which would be highly rewarding if we weren't bombarding our brains with these other high-potency drugs. The other thing, too, is that it's possible to get dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. So I talk about this in the book as pressing on the pain side first. So that is intentionally doing things that are difficult to get those gremlins to switch over to the pleasure side in an effort to bring that balance level. Again, because they will do that. It works both ways. For example, we know that when people engage in exercise, dopamine levels will increase over the latter or last part of the exercise and then remain elevated for hours afterwards before coming back down to the baseline level of tonic dopamine firing without going below baseline into that dopamine deficit state. So that's great. That means we got a hit of dopamine that lasted for hours that never required us to get into the state of craving, anxiety, despair, because we did the work up front in order to get that dopamine. Other methods are things like intermittent fasting, ice cold water plunges, but even effortful engagement, creative pursuits, your academic pursuits, your focused flow concentration is a great source of dopamine. They're effortful, right? You have to pay for your dopamine up front.
So let's say that I'm a Netflix addict. I'm watching Netflix like 3 or 4 hours. Let's say I had a hard day at work. I came home and I know that Netflix is the way to go. And I know I feel safe there by watching it. But I know that somewhat I'm addicted to Netflix, so I wanted to work on that to recover. Books recommend exercise or writing the journal or meditation, so that's good. But I still think that there is a very, very tiny moment between when you feel like, oh, I want to watch Netflix. Netflix is the only thing that I want to do. And later on, when you feel like, oh, no, let's not do it. I'll write about it instead, or I'll go out and exercise or take a walk. So there is still there's very moment in between those two different moments, I think. And I kind of keep failing handling that moment probably. Is there anything that we could do to win the fight in the moment?
So, I mean, I think that's very insightful of you, and you described that really well. We can all relate to that. We wake up in the morning with that new resolve not to do a certain behavior at the end of the day, and the end of the day comes, and we do the behavior. We're tired, our willpower is exhausted, we feel like we've worked hard all day, we want to reward ourselves, the reward is right there. What I recommend is something called a dopamine fast, where we actually commit in advance to abstaining from our drug of choice, whatever it is, in this case Netflix, for 4 weeks. Why 4 weeks? Because 4 weeks is the average amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. Now, you could say, well, okay, you're asking me to quit for 4 weeks. I can't even quit for one night. How have you helped me? It does make a difference when you mentally and potentially verbally commit to this period of 30 days or 4 weeks of abstinence, and you prepare for it in advance. And one of the key points of preparation is what I call self-binding. Self-binding is the ways that we actually put both literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, so that we're not relying exclusively on willpower to not use. We're actually making a barrier that allows us to press that pause button between desire and consumption and have just enough time to do something else. So for Netflix, the example would be that you would unsubscribe from Netflix, for example. Anything you can do to create barriers. Maybe you want to have, they make these timed safes now where you can actually put your smartphone or your laptop in a safe and put the timer on.
I do have it.
Yeah. And that will force you, to not. And then in place of, that activity, you want to do activities that are actually more painful than withdrawal. So a lot of things people are like, okay, I'm going to give up Netflix, but I'm going to smoke pot instead. Or I'm going to give up Netflix, but I'm going to eat chocolate cake. That's not a good idea, because that will just trigger your reward pathway and make you want to watch Netflix even more. Instead, what you do is you say, you know what, in the evening, I'm going to go for a walk. Or I'm going to write a letter to a friend or a relative every evening. I'm going to read a really difficult book. I've been wanting to read about, the history of South Korea. And what people find is that the first 2 weeks are really difficult as we're in withdrawal with that balance weighted to the side of pain. But slowly, those gremlins get the message. They start to hop off. And by about 10 to 14 days, we find that our balance is beginning to go back to the level position. It's less hard. And also we're able to enjoy more modest rewards, right? We're able to actually start to remember what it felt like to enjoy reading a good book or reading the newspaper in the evening or just sitting and watching the sunset with a nice warm cup of tea or something like that. By the time they get to week 4 or 30 days, they really feel much better. They're less anxious, they're less depressed, they've gotten a lot more stuff done that they had wanted to get done, not just the stuff at work, but like they cleaned out their closet, stuff that every day they come, oh, I need to clean out that closet. Oh, I need to clean out that closet. All of a sudden that closet is clean. They reached out to people, they've made connections again. The auto stimulation that we get from Netflix and other digital media, it really is the same as kind of getting drunk every night. And it just isolates us more and more.
I want to talk a little bit about how to get out of detox. So, for example, I did 30-day no smartphone challenge multiple times.
Okay.
And I feel great.
Yeah.
Like, this is amazing. My quality of the sleep is better.
Yeah.
I was more present and house is clean.
Yeah, right.
As you described,
Yeah.
like you can see it, the difference. But in the end, I came back to square one. What happened to me, it same thing happened to me with intermittent fasting. So you haven't done this for 30 days. Now you are so waiting to go back and you end up binge eating the food or you end up binge watching the Netflix because you are 30 days away from that. So is there any strategy to smartly get out of the detox so that you don't go back to your old habit even after feeling amazing, even after seeing all these good changes?
Right. The key with being successful after the dopamine fast is to make a very specific plan, and make it tailored to your individual needs, but just make this is how I'm going to use digital media going forward, and then see what works. Like you tried it and you didn't work, so you need to come up with a different plan, right? Something that's working better for you.
So we've been talking about quitting or detoxing. There is a group of people who said it is possible to moderately use. But there is a group of people, no, that's not possible. You should quit 100%. Is there such a thing like moderately using once you are addicted to something? Can you go back to that?
Yeah, so this is a great question and a really relevant question for beer or other alcohols, but also for food, which food has become highly drugified, and also for digital devices because those are a part of our everyday lives, so many of us can't quit them. The old way of thinking was that once you had become addicted to alcohol, the only pathway for recovery was to abstain from alcohol. But recently what we're finding is that some people can, with tremendous effort and after a period of abstinence, so that's really important, you have to have that dopamine fast first, they can return to using alcohol in moderation. And I have had patients who have been alcoholic or addicted to alcohol who after a long period of abstinence were able to return to drinking and keep it in a moderate amount, but it took a lot of effort for them to do that. They had to do a lot of self-binding, right? A lot of accountability, a lot of tracking so that they could be honest with themselves and with others. Some of them say, it's kind of not even worth it because with 1 or 2 drinks, I don't get the feeling that I want. I'd rather just not drink at all.
But abstinence should come first.
Yes.
Before.
Yeah, you have to do the minimum of 4 weeks of abstinence in order to, again, what you need to do is you need to reset dopamine reward thresholds. If you just try to slowly reduce, you're never going to reset those reward pathways and you're always going to be craving. So what the dopamine fast allows is for people to get out of that state of constant craving and mental preoccupation with their drug, and they kind of feel free, right? And then once they get out of that, if they want to go back to using, if they use in very modest amounts and can keep it modest, then they can drink in moderation. Most people with severe alcoholism who try to return to drinking are not successful. They have what you experience with Netflix, and I experienced with romance novels, a kind of what we call an abstinence violation syndrome.
So I tried many times to tame my demon, including Netflix and beer and other things. There is some frustration.
Yeah.
You keep trying, but you're not changing there. So there is a frustration, and at some point I think you just ended up giving up on quitting. Whatever, like I still have the job, I can work. Like there is this what they call high performing addicts, and I can be one of them. How do we deal with that frustration of failing? I mean, it would be the best if we just succeed with the quitting at the first trial, but if that doesn't happen.
Yeah. First of all, people shouldn't give up, because the more times they try to quit, the more likely they will eventually quit. For cigarette smoking, there's actually good data on that the more times you try to quit, the more likely you will be successful.
So we should just keep pushing,
keep pushing.
Until we succeed.
Yeah. Keep pushing, keep trying something different every time. Because the life of being addicted, at first it may seem like, oh, it's worth the trade-off. But as we age and as our brains age, the costs get higher and higher, and we isolate more and more. And I don't think anybody wants to live like that.
So this is a question for the people who are not sure if they're addicted, but they feel like this is not right or it could be better. How do we self-assess whether we are addicted to something?
Yeah, so a couple things. If you find you're lying about your use to other people, even if you're just sort of decreasing the amount of time that you're spending, or saying, you're working, but you're really not working, that's a red flag for that you're doing a behavior that you've now sort of teetered into compulsive overconsumption and maybe even a mild addiction. So lying is something to look for. If you find that you have a lot of mental preoccupation or narrowing of your focus to just using your drug, it's the only thing that you enjoy, you don't enjoy other things, you look forward to it all day, things that you used to enjoy are no longer pleasurable, that's highly suggestive that you've changed your hedonic or joy set point and literally physiologically lost the ability to take joy in more modest rewards.
We do have 7 minutes, so using that 7 minutes, I want to share some of Korean readers' reviews and feedback about the book. So I think that's a good way to kind of end this conversation. And many people have read it, so this is all Korean version. There are a lot. These are some of the reviews that I brought among many from the online bookstores. People were saying that for some people this book can be a life changer. One person said that this book literally changed my life.
I'm very honored. The book has been translated into now, I think, 25 languages and counting, but the Korean version is my absolute favorite in terms of how it was done and how it was translated and how they took the artwork and kind of made it their own. So I'm very grateful for that. And then I would just say to folks out there, you're not alone. We're all struggling. One of the huge messages that I hoped I would get across by sharing my story is that you can be, an academic faculty member at Stanford and know a lot about addiction and still get addicted to something like romance novels. I think we're all looking for that kind of escape from our high-pressure lives. So I really urge you to give this a try, living without your drug of choice, and see it as an opportunity not just to explore yourself in your own life, but potentially be of service to others, because so many people are suffering and struggling in the world today. We have so much. It's this plenty paradox, right? We have so much, and yet we're so unhappy. And we really need everybody to help each other figure out how can we live more joyful and thriving lives in what's paradoxically a very difficult time in human history to be alive.